I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 187th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the inner workings of your own brain. And in today's episode, perhaps the inner workings of every single cell in your body. Cellular life as we know it has a lot of common elements, and of course, two of the most common are hydrogen and oxygen in that well-known and well-loved molecule H2O, best known as water. Something that we're all familiar with, we assume that we know quite well. And yet today's episode poses the question, could this highly familiar substance have untapped secrets lurking in its depths? In this case, the depths of only a few micrometers. We're not talking about sea monsters or anything like that. We're talking about something that's called the fourth phase of water, alternately called EZ water. We'll hear where that acronym came from in the interview. I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Gerald Pollack from the University of Washington. He's one of the primary researchers who's been publishing information about this fourth phase of water. And if you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you why, if you're a guy listening to this podcast, odds are probably better than average that you have a dad who is older than average at the time of your birth. Why is this? It's because I'm assuming that if you're listening to this podcast, you might be a little bit geeky, and there's science now seeming to prove that older dads have geekier sons. I will explain that in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But first things first, as usual, we will kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So a spoiler alert for the coming interview. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is just how pervasive infrared light is. If you're a living organism on planet Earth, it's hard to get away from this stuff. And light, it seems, turns up in the darndest places. Recent studies have shown that there's quite a bit more visual spectrum light available in the human uterus than was previously thought. And that yes, the visual life of human fetuses probably begins earlier than we'd really given credit. Earlier animal studies in mice have shown that the penetration of light into the mouse mother's uterus is actually necessary in order to prime the brains of her mouse offspring so that they can actually process light correctly once they're born. So light getting into the mouse uterus apparently really matters, and it stands to reason that there might be similar importance for at least some amount of light making it through the mother's belly in humans. A study published recently in Current Biology shows that fetuses at 34 weeks of gestation respond differently, and in fact respond more enthusiastically when shown intrauterine face shapes projected from the outside versus other sorts of shapes. So what the researchers did in this study is they did two technologies at once. First of all, they were shining light through the mother's belly that they were pretty sure the fetus could actually interpret and see something, and they could tell that because they were also using ultrasound technology, watching as the fetus would swivel its head to follow moving shapes. So they could see that the fetuses had the ability to track these shapes and follow movement, and it turned out that they would follow them preferentially if the shape that they were shown could be interpreted as a human face. Now, as you might imagine, the shapes that were blasted through in light rays on the inside of the woman's uterus were not very convincing portrayals of a human face. Nothing that you or I would recognize as even a cartoon drawing of a face. Super simple features, eyes and a mouth. And to have a control group for this experiment, they had this face shape oriented in two ways. They had it either right side up or inverted, so upside down. And the right side up face was tracked preferentially by these fetuses versus the upside down face. Says Vincent Reed of Lancaster University, one of the researchers. There was the possibility that the fetus would find any shape interesting due to the novelty of the stimulus. If this was the case, we would have seen no difference in how they responded to the upright and the upside-down versions. But it turned out that they responded in a way that was very similar to infants. This research was also actually the first to confirm that human fetuses have enough light to have visual experiences inside the womb. But turning over the old "don't play this at home" card, Reed says that he discourages pregnant mothers from shining bright lights into their bellies.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Richie Dean from the USA says, if you find the idea of making the 3 pounds of white and gray matter between your ears function to its utmost potential, then you're going to want to do yourself and the world a favor and download every episode of SDS and binge listen until you've soaked up every last drop of knowledge that has been recorded on this legendary podcast. Legendary might be laying it on a bit thick, but I'm very, very flattered. And They Call Me Dale, also from the USA, says, as a student of psychopharmacology, I'm both personally fascinated by and academically appreciative of the work that Jesse is doing over at Smart Drug Smarts. This is one podcast you just can't afford to skip through because there's no wasted space. If you're interested in neuroscience and value your listening time like I do yourself a favor and add SDS to your playlist. Well, a big thanks to both of you. Thanks to all of the Johnny Appleseeds of Smart Drug Smart's URL distribution. Anything and everything that you can do to spread the word is absolutely swell. And I say it every week, not because it's part of the script or there's somebody standing here with a cue card, but because the positive word of mouth, in whatever form that takes, really does help expand the ripples in the pool and help more people find out about this. A little reminder, July 5th is Workaholics Day. I'm not sure if it's being contiguous to 4th of July as representative of anything, but because it's happening before next week's episode, I wanted to wish you a happy Workaholics Day now. In order to help you celebrate Workaholics Day, we're going to be having a special Workaholics Day sale over at axonlabs.io. Axon Labs, you may recall, is the retail wing of Smart Drug Smart's operations. If you happen to be on the Smart Drug Smart's website, there's a shop link up at the top that'll take you over there. And since we do ship internationally and workaholism knows no borders, it seemed more appropriate to have a Workaholics Day sale than a 4th of July sale. Details to be announced on July 5th, Workaholics Day, but stop on by and we'll make it worth your while. Axon Labs has 2 stacks over there, Nexus and Mitogen. Nexus is an aniracetam-based cognitive stack, Mitogen a mitochondrial support stack, helpful in promoting the manufacture and recycling of ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate, the common energy currency of the body and a staple of every good workaholic. If being a workaholic is wrong, I don't want to be right. But anyway, mark that on your calendar, July 5th at axonlabs.io. We'll see you there for a little something special. One of the things that I've been working on is getting ready for Waterfast Week 2017, which is going to be happening in just over a week. On July 10th is going to be our kickoff day. We've got over 100 people now who have signed up for Waterfast Week. I would doubt that we will actually have that many people that pull the trigger and participate in it. I think a lot of people are testing the waters, so to speak. Apologies, by the way, about all the water puns that will inevitably make it into this episode. But yeah, as far as that goes, it is not coincidental that we're having an episode about water just before Waterfast Week kicks off. For those of you who are wondering why I might go a week consuming nothing but water, I would direct your attention back to episode number 56 of this show, where I interviewed Dr. Thomas Seyfried of Boston College, talking about his theories positing cancer, or at least most kinds of cancer, as being a metabolic disease, with cancer cells being particularly vulnerable to low sugar environments. Normally, glucose, our blood sugar, is the primary way that we're transporting energy around the body, but as every dieter knows, you can also live on fat stores. You can also live on nutritional fat in much the same way. The energetic breakdown products of fats are called ketone bodies, ketones, ketosis, and ketogenic diets we've talked about before as well. But the gist of doing the week-long water fast is trying to get into a deep state of ketosis for the second half of that week. The first couple of days, you're just kind of flushing all the excess sugar out of your system. But days 4 through 7, essentially, you're starving. The healthy cells within your body are doing fine. They're figuring out how to live on the ketones. They might be sputtering a little bit, not exactly happy, but they're doing okay. But according to theory anyway, if there's any little stray cancer cells that might be somewhere floating around within your body, haven't really gotten a foothold yet, you're turning your internal environment so inhospitable to them that hopefully they die off, and in the course of inconveniencing yourself for a few days, you're nipping cancer in the bud should you have any cancers that are maybe trying to get established. This is an unproven theory, and Dr. Seyfried himself, he's the first to tell you that, but the idea is a 1 week per year prophylactic treatment. I'm putting air quotes around the word treatment, but one of those things where the upside of lessening your chance of getting cancer, to my mind personally, is worth the cost, the inconvenience of going hungry for a week. So this is going to be my 3rd year doing it, and middle of summer seemed as good a time as any. The first time we did it, it was February. There was still snow on the ground for some of the people that were participating, and that just seemed like unnecessarily cruel and miserable to make people go hungry during that time of year. It is not too late, by the way, if you're listening to this episode in timely fashion after it's released and you want to get in on the water fast. You can sign up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/waterfast, waterfast all one word. We'll get you loaded up with all the relevant information. No complex recipes in a water fast. That's one good thing, but there is a lot to know about the changes that will take place in your body during that week. So again, if you're curious, smartdrugsmarts.com/waterfast.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So right up there with Why Did the Chicken Cross the Road in the rankings of best known jokes in the entire world is the one about the 2 fish that are swimming along. Another fish sees them and says, "Hey, how's the water?" That fish gives him a wink and goes on his way, and then one of the other 2 fish looks at his pal and says, "What's water?" We all kind of get the idea. Sometimes something is so familiar that it becomes essentially invisible to us. And why that joke strikes me as particularly relevant to this episode is the irony that we're going to be looking at water itself. Probably the first molecule that most of us learn when we're kids. One of the first substances that we know the word for when we're learning to talk. I mean, water is really as familiar gets. So it's a little hard to grasp the concept that we don't have water completely figured out forwards and backwards by this point. But those are some of the murky ideas that we're going to be delving into in the coming interview. We all know that we should probably be drinking more glasses of water per day than the average person does, that water makes up a huge proportion of our bodies, and that if our percent of bodily water drops in the course of getting dehydrated, that can really adversely affect our physical performance and our ability to think and concentrate. But if you're scouring around looking for health advice, different ways of optimizing, you may very likely have seen advertisements for structured water. This goes by a variety of different names, but a lot of times you'll see some fairly fantastic health claims. It is hard not to raise a skeptical eyebrow when people try to sell you expensive water or expensive devices that claim to rearrange the molecules of your water in a way that matters. I will say going into this that based on some of the claims I've seen around structured water and what it can do for people, I definitely had my skepticism radar turned on high, but I was very encouraged when I read front and center in Dr. Pollack's webpage, multiple companies producing water-based products use my picture to imply that we endorse their products. We have no formal association with any company, nor do I receive fees from any company producing water-based products. So in the coming interview, we're going to try to dispel the murk and get to some clarity in this talk about the fourth phase of water. Now let's dive in with Dr. Gerald Pollack.
Everybody knows that when you're born, you're roughly 80% water. And when you get to have gray hair, then the percentage of water drops to probably about 60% or something like that. And this 2/3 water that we talk about, this is by volume. So the water molecule is so small that in order to fill up this 2/3 volume, you need a lot of water molecules. And people have computed, and if you do a molecular count, if you say line up all the molecules in your body, more than 99 out of 100 molecules are water molecules. So water is regarded as, I wouldn't say trivial, but not so significant part of your body or physiology. You know, we think of it mostly as the stuff that bathes the important molecules of life.
Yeah, it's like sort of the packing peanuts of biology.
You might say so. That's a really good way of putting it. I was involved in the molecular mechanism of muscle contraction, actin, myosin, how those proteins interacted to produce force and motion. And almost nobody in the field ever thinks about the water inside the muscle. We think of the proteins inside the muscle as somehow interacting, folding, unfolding, bending, whatever, giving rise to contraction. And it's kind of almost arrogant to think that 99% of the molecules do nothing. And that's actually one of the reasons why I changed fields and moved into water, because it was clear to me that the so-called structured water was a really important concept and not a new one. I got to tell you that there was a scientist, or still is, he's 98 years old and kicking. His name is Gilbert Ling. Gilbert wrote, I think, 7 books by now, all about the kind of water that exists inside the cell. And Gilbert marshaled a lot of evidence, not only his, but evidence from other people gathered over the years that indicated that inside our cells, the water is not like water in a glass with the molecules bouncing around a huge number of times per second and randomly, but actually ordered. Call it structured. A lot of people call it structured. You know, what that means is that the molecules are somehow organized and ordered like a liquid crystal. And I wrote a book about this in 2001. It's called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. The book is controversial because it challenges some well-regarded dogmas in biology, but it also talks about water, and it marshals evidence that the water is deeply, integrally involved in every major process inside the cell. So I got interested in this kind of structured water, and I thought, boy, if we could only do some experiments on this, wouldn't that be interesting? Prevailing view is that if you have some sort of surface, that water is next to the surface, that the surface has some capacity to order the adjacent water molecules, maybe for 2 or 3 molecular layers. But Gilbert Ling was arguing for dozens of molecular layers. And in our experimental work, we found up to millions of molecular layers.
Given how small a water molecule actually is, that number of layers, what does that translate to in terms of actual length? I guess micrometers probably.
200 or 300 micrometers. I'm not suggesting that this occurs in biology inside the cell, because there isn't so much space. The cell itself is less than 100 micrometers, and some of them are much smaller. But there is a capacity that we demonstrated. So the first thing that we found, this is based on a hint I got from some Japanese scientist who I met at a conference, and based on what he told me, we developed a preparation. It was really simple. You take a flask of water with little particles in it. We used microspheres, little spheres, and we took a chunk of gel, and we put the gel in the flask of microspheres, and we looked. So what we found is over a period of 3, 4, 5 minutes, right next to the gel, all the microspheres got excluded. Something near the surface was pushing out these microspheres. And the size of this zone was, at first it was 100 or so micrometers, but we found with other kinds of gels or other surfaces up to a half a millimeter, and sometimes even close to a millimeter, and much more under extreme circumstances. But anyway, it's pretty big. And so we called it the exclusion zone. And exclusion zone, easy to remember. So we called it easy water. It may be an unfortunate choice because it doesn't really describe very much about the water. It just describes that a lot of stuff is excluded. We found it was not just microspheres that were excluded, but most substances are excluded from this. And, if you think about it, it's like a crystal. And when crystals form, in order to get pure crystal, any junk or stuff that's contaminated gets pushed out. One of the major properties is that, water is neutral, but this region is actually negatively charged. It's negatively charged because it's formed from water, and the water molecules, under appropriate conditions, split. Water molecules split into H plus and OH minus. And this is nothing unusual because the first step of photosynthesis is exactly that. It's the splitting of water into OH minus and H plus. And the OH minuses gather together to form a kind of matrix that is that exclusion zone. And the other parts of the molecule, the positive, the H plus, get ejected from that zone or are sitting in the water. So you got negative EZ, positive water. It's like a battery, and we can collect electrical energy from that. And we've done it. We even have a patent on that because it's interesting. So the question you haven't asked, because I've been talking too much, but you might ask as well, you can't get something for nothing. So where does the input energy come from to do all this? One clue is, as I mentioned, when water splits in photosynthesis, it's light that is responsible. The photons are coming in, and that's the energy that's driving the photosynthetic process. And so this isn't how we got to the answer, but it's a logical deduction. So one thing that you might think of is maybe light is responsible for building, for the energy for building this ordered zone and separating the charge, because you got to have energy from somewhere. Well, it turned out to be correct. One student who was playing around with a chamber where we had the gel or certain polymers instead of the gel, sitting on a bench, and he had a gooseneck lamp next to it. So he took the lamp and shined it on the chamber, and sure enough, he said, hey, this looks pretty interesting, because in the region where the light is falling, this exclusion zone builds hugely. And so it looks like the ordered water, structured water, easy water is building as a consequence of light. And we found something astonishing, that most of the wavelengths contributed to the buildup of this, but the most powerful was infrared at roughly 3 micrometers. It was like 100 times more powerful. And if you think about where infrared comes from, it's everywhere. You almost can't get rid of it. So, for example, at night, if you take your cell phone camera, you won't see anything. But if you get an infrared camera where the sensor is sensitive to infrared, you get a beautiful image of everything.
Yeah, that's the night vision goggles and stuff. They use infrared.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. It's infrared. So what it means is that the energy that's required to build this kind of water is always available. And if you add more infrared, you get bigger zones. And if you could take away the energy, which we finally figured out how to do, then you get less of it.
Let me ask you this. From what I understand, a lot of the consensus now around how life started is in the deep sea oceanic vents that are populated by chemosynthetic organisms. And this is probably really the only place that we know of where there are living things, but there is no light to speak of. Would it be fair to assume that those organisms down there would not have access to even the infrared light, and therefore within their cells you might not see these EZ zones in their water?
Good question, but I think the answer is opposite of what you're suggesting, because what's infrared is basically heat. We talk of it as heat, but it's really infrared radiation. So, for example, you turn on your toaster and you look inside, and of course it gets warm, but people talk about, oh, these coils are generating infrared energy. The two are almost synonymous with one another. So these vents that you're talking about, these vents are spewing warm streams of product. And so this is a huge and abundant source of infrared energy. And that's why there are so many species down there. And I would argue the opposite, that probably these species are just full of easy water because of that. So easy water grows, it builds next to hydrophilic surfaces. So what's hydrophilic? Water loving, as opposed to hydrophobic, water fearing. And so it's the hydrophilic surfaces typically that when water meets one of those surfaces, it forms EZ water, structured water, ordered water, liquid crystal water, fourth phase water. We call it fourth phase because it really is another phase of water. And we grow up understanding that water actually has three phases, solid, liquid, and vapor. But, there are so many anomalies of water that can't be explained with the three phases that you need to have a fourth phase in order to explain it. If you look on the web, Martin Chaplin has a website listing, I think, some 70 or so anomalies of water. So when you get to 70,
right. You start looking for a new theory.
Yeah, you start looking for a new theory. And so it's exciting because I think we found that what was predicted 100 years ago, that water has four phases, not three phases. And we know a lot about its properties.
So the three phases of water that we're taught about in high school or middle school chemistry, they're all kind of defined by some combination of temperature and pressure. But from what I'm understanding, there would be quite a bit of overlap, I guess, between sort of standard issue water and EZ water, but still within the same temperature range. Is this phase kind of temperature independent or?
No, it seems like it, but it's not. So we studied both of those variables, and it turns out that if you exert pressure on water, it turns to EZ water. We published that a couple of years ago. And temperature has a profound effect on this water. So if you start with ordinary water and you reduce the temperature, say from room temperature, you start diminishing. What happens is when you reach roughly past 15 degrees centigrade, EZ begins to form. And it grows and grows. And it's this EZ, as you get the temperature low enough, that turns into ice. So water doesn't go directly to ice, which clears up a lot of anomalies. Water transitions into EZ water, which then transitions to ice. So yes, it is responsive to pressure and temperature, and it's bounded because it builds up and then it stops. And so those are the usual criteria for a phase. So a lot of people are talking about this. It hasn't made its way so much into the community of physics and chemistry, but it's made its way into health practitioners, especially integrative health people and wellness kinds of people. For them, this has kind of become common knowledge. And some of them are actually building therapies based on this kind of water because they know that our bodies are filled with this stuff.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people that are sort of advocating drinking structured water as opposed to run-of-the-mill water. But here's where the dots are not connecting for me. If this is a phase that water can pass into and out of in the same sort of ways as that water might get hotter or colder, does consuming water in one form versus another, does that make a difference? I mean, couldn't the water structure itself, once it's already in your body, even if you're drinking regular tap water or what have you?
Yeah, totally. The kind of water you drink should make a big difference in your well-being. Let me explain why. So your cells, and actually outside your cells too, is filled with EZ water. Practically every water molecule is right near a hydrophilic surface. And there's plenty of infrared energy to build it. And there are other reasons to conclude that you're full of EZ water. However, if you don't have a full complement of EZ water surrounding each protein, for example, the proteins, in order to do their work, they fold. They go from unfolded to folded. And normally, each one is surrounded by EZ water. The EZ water is stuck to the protein. The two are actually one and the same. They're just two phases of one structure. But if you don't have it, if you don't have enough of it, then the proteins are not folding properly because they're not in their normal environment. So basically, you have pathology. If you have pathology, you want to reverse the pathology. And one way you could do that is by restoring the EZ water. So how do you restore it? Well, putting infrared energy, expose yourself to it is one way. That's why maybe you feel good after a sauna. Increasingly, alternative and complementary practitioners are using infrared to reverse pathologies and various issues. So you could do that. But your question was about the kind of water. So if you drink water that has a lot of EZ water, it should basically replace what might be missing from your cells. If you drink plain water that doesn't have any of that, well, in theory, you should be able to build up EZ water from that just by exposure to infrared. I suppose spring water, some people have made measurements of spring water, and these waters often, I'm not sure if always, often have a huge content of EZ water. It's a simple measurement that you can do. It's a spectroscopic measurement to tell how much EZ water is. And spring waters are generally touted to be good for health. People seek them out.
Would the reason behind that, would that be because there are small particulate solids that are hydrophilic interspersed within the water, so you're getting these little sort of exclusion zones formed around these free-floating microscopic particles? Is that what's going on there?
Precisely. There are two things. One is that the minerals or particles, hydrophilic particles suspended, they grow easy around them. And the second is that these are usually under pressure. They're usually deep down, a lot of water above them exerting pressure. And we found experimentally that the more pressure you have, the more easy that you have. You're drinking water that should be, at least in theory, should be good for your health. And I know a lot of people think that it is. I don't know how strong the evidence is. One would like to trust what the company has done to test their product, but we all know that, there's a bit of bias. And what's needed is for an independent group to test the biological impact of different kinds of waters. We'd like to do that, but unfortunately, to do it requires a lot of resources, personnel, supplies, what have you. And
yeah, you got a little bit of a catch-22 situation there, because you're still going to just be testing water, or whatever you come out with on the other end data-wise. There's not going to be a patentable product there, some way for people to recoup the investment of the research.
Well, if you're in a mind frame where the kind of water you drink is irrelevant to health, that's true. And unfortunately, I think that many of the reviewers at NIH are of that frame because, as I said, water is, it's just H2O. It's just a background carrier of the more important molecules of life. And so spending a few $1 million to study different waters, this is totally nuts. But I think with what we've learned that it's critically important to do that, to find out which waters are good for health. It would be wonderful for humanity. It really needs to be done.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier, which was that it's really only just in the past decade or so that a lot of these findings have come to light. Is that just because people really weren't looking for this prior to 10 years ago, or is there some new technological breakthrough that's allowed people to look now in different ways?
No, here's what happened. Before around 1950, water was a discipline that was of interest to a lot of people. Physicists, chemists were deeply involved in water. Many people knew it was critical for nature and also life. For example, the father of modern biochemistry, Albert St. George, who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of vitamin C, and went on to study muscle and water and cancer and so many things. And, he's regarded as a Nobelist among Nobelists. And one of his pithy quotes, of which he's got many, is, "Life is water dancing to the tune of solids." So long ago, we're talking about 60, 70 years ago, a lot of people were interested in water and the central role of water in life in particular. And then two things happened that dissuaded scientists from entering into the water. You might say two debacles. The first one was the so-called polywater debacle, where some Russians found that there were some really interesting features of water. They put water in small capillary tubes. They examined the water, and they found that the properties of that water in these tubes differed markedly from properties of ordinary water. At first, it was in Russia, and the stuff wasn't translated into English. There were no routine translations. It was a Cold War. We as Americans, I remember as a kid, we were taught to think of the Soviets as cruel and incompetent. Then, of course, came Sputnik, and that notion was quickly dispelled. And finally, when news of this kind of water got to the U.S., it was really interesting because a new kind of water, and it was done by Boris Deryagin. Deryagin was the premier physical chemist in all of Russia. So because it was the Cold War, you could imagine that the American and other Western scientists, they had a couple of choices. One is to say, this is the biggest nonsense that there ever was created. And the other was to actually take up the results and see if they could learn more and maybe even bootstrap the Russians and find some interesting stuff beyond what they'd found. So there was a lead article in Science. Its title was Polywater. And what's polywater? A polymer of water. These chemists from the University of Maryland said this kind of water that the Russians discovered, it's behaving like a polymer rather than a lot of little molecules that are independent of one another. And then about 2 or 3 months after that paper was published, a few Westerners did some experiments. And one group, they examined the supposedly pure water that was lodging inside of capillary tubes. Turns out it wasn't pure. The water was actually leaching some of the silica from the glass itself. And so a lot of people became concerned about this. Maybe it's not real. And then the lid was nailed onto the coffin by a group who put salt in the water, and they got some results that they said were practically identical to what the Russians measured. And they said, well, the Russians must have been sweating into their water. So big joke, but this caused real problem. And well, it turned out Deryagin wrote a paper 2 or 3 years later, and he admitted that he screwed up. This was kind of a bit of a surprise because usually scientists don't do it. And, from then on, practically every scientist who's ever heard of anything like that will talk about this as one of the stupid things that can happen when you study water. So, the Soviet regime was embarrassed by all this, and it was more convenient for them to lay blame on a particular scientist than to accept that Russian science is flawed. Basically, the field of water research ground to a halt after this. And it picked up a little bit. Then there was a second incident that is actually more interesting. A famous French scientist, a high-level guy with a laboratory of 50 people, highly regarded, started studying the concept that water might have a memory. It might be able to store information. And of course, the scientific community thought this was ludicrous. So the guy got crucified, and it had to do with the editor of Nature, who put together a committee of peers, which included a magician, a fraud specialist, and they basically demolished his career. And by the way, this guy's results have been confirmed many times by many people. I organized the International Conference on Physics, Chemistry, and Biology of Water, and this guy is considered a hero at this conference because many people who attend this conference have themselves confirmed his results. So you got 2 debacles that took place about 20 years apart, and because of this, people still are timid about studying water.
It really is interesting how scientific disciplines can kind of go into and out of fashion, and not all science sort of proceeds at the same pace, one domain to the next, one decade to the next. So does this 4th phase of water have something like, I'm thinking like a nuclear half-life, where if I've got a glass of structured water sitting on my counter, how long will it be until it discombobulates and is essentially just a glass of regular water?
I can't answer that. I can only tell you that there's evidence both ways. One, that it just withers and gets destroyed, and the other is that persists indefinitely. The first example is if we scrape off what we see next to a gel surface or a polymer surface as EZ and look at it in the microscope, we can see it gradually reducing to 0 in about 30 minutes or so. That's a kind of artificial situation, but another is an Italian group who use actually this scraping process that I talk about. They take a polymer called Naphion, which grows very nice EZs, and they scrape it and they put it into a beaker, and then they do the same thing again. They pour more water, and the EZ grows on the Naphion surface. They scrape it and collect it. And they do this hundreds of times, and you put it in the beaker, and you let the beaker sit. And what they find is clear water mostly, but right in the middle is a giant cloud. And this cloud persists certainly after, it was, I think, a month or 6 weeks, the samples that I saw. In fact, if they go to the next step and they basically dehydrate, they pull off all the water, they wind up with a solid. This is solid water at room temperature.
Whoa.
Whoa is right. They think that this is basically EZ water that they've got. So EZ water it's like a lattice, a liquid crystalline lattice where the molecules are connected together, which is really essentially a solid.
Was this a large enough size to see with the naked eye sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, they did it in my presence when I visited the laboratory, and they gave us a sample. You could put it in your hand and feel it. It's fragile. It feels a bit like a wound up thread in a bunch. But, you put it in your hand and you feel it, and it just breaks up from that into a powder.
Whoa, okay. I'm having a hard time visualizing this. When you say breaks up into a powder, can you explain that?
You can imagine you start with a thread, and the thread is wound in a bunch, like a knot of some sort, a very loose knot, and you start squeezing it with your fingers a little bit, and it just falls apart. So it means the threads that form the knot are very fragile.
So is this like a fistful of Jell-O sort of thing, where it kind of breaks up into smaller Jell-O?
It doesn't feel wet at all. It's completely dry.
Wow. That is really bizarre.
Yeah, this is amazing. So getting back to, in response to your question, is that this EZ, they put it in the beaker, and the beaker is standing for a month or 6 weeks, and you could see this cloud full of EZ. And so that's persisting. And I think the reason it persists is that the energy that builds it is infrared energy, and there's lots of infrared energy all around. And maybe it's the infrared energy that keeps this thing persisting. Or maybe this is actually a more stable state of water that occurs naturally and stays that way unless perturbed to do something else. But it can persist for a very long time. So I've run you through quite a lot of seemingly radical stuff. I don't want to speculate further because I think you'll probably conclude that there's too much speculation here. As my friend tells me, my editor, he said, after you have a good meal, it's nice to have a strawberry shortcake, but not 15 strawberry shortcakes.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Gerald Pollack for taking the time for that conversation. It is, of course, really fascinating to think that there might still be undiscovered secrets in the seemingly most familiar of substances. Although really, if the standard issue water that we find within living cells and within natural water sources like streams, things like that, if that winds up being structured water, it almost feels like structured water should kind of get grandfathered in and get the name water. And it's the other form that should have to have some sort of epithet applied to its name, like randomized water, something like that. But I thought his point was a great one about once you come up with a sufficient number of anomalies in any given theory, you really need to start questioning the basic assumptions in that theory. But that said, and I'm glad Dr. Pollack made a point of this, is there's a major difference between what we know about the physical chemistry of water and the fact that in many instances it might be forming this exclusion zone form of water, but that doesn't make its effects within living cells and within our bodies anything more than speculation at this point, which isn't trying to rain on anybody's parade. I'm not trying to be a wet blanket, and I certainly don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I would be very cautious about making any actual investments in structured water systems or buying structured water for personal consumption because we just don't know yet. And honestly, it seems to me, based on our bodies being able to take in raw materials and make of them what we need, it would seem really strange to me if we couldn't take in disordered water molecules and reorder those into whatever lattice structure our cells need for their internal environment. That seems like it would be sort of the table stakes for being a living cell. Dr. Pollack's layperson-friendly book on structured water is called The Fourth Phase of Water. That's available on Amazon, on Kindle, all the places you would normally find books, and we'll put a link to that on the Smart Drug Smarts bookshelf page as well. That's smartdrugsmarts.com/bookshelf. So that's all for structured water, but this episode itself has not yet run dry. We've still got a little bit of something left for you in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Normally when you see the acronym GI in a scientific context, you assume that it means gastrointestinal. And that's normally a pretty safe bet, but in this particular study, the researchers used GI to refer to a geek index, which was a score that they gave kids participating in this study. I kind of hope for the sake of the kids' self-esteem, they didn't actually tell the kids what their geek index score was, but they were trying to come up with a numerical measure of geek-like traits, including nonverbal IQ, the ability to maintain strong focus on the subject of interest, and levels of social aloofness, not caring too much what your peer group thinks about you. The researchers from this recent study at King's College London got their data from 15,000 UK-based twin pairs in the Twins Early Development Study. In addition to testing the kids directly, the parents of the kids were also asked whether their child cares about how they're perceived by their peers, and if the kids had any interests that take up a substantial majority of their free time. This testing, by the way, took place at 12 years of age. One result that popped out when they were looking at what in the kid's background correlated to higher levels of geekiness was a sex-specific finding specific to boys in this case, and positively correlated with the age of the boy's father. Older fathers tended to have sons who were more intelligent, more focused, and less concerned about fitting in. And this effect persisted after controlling for the parents' social and economic status, their qualifications, whether they were employed, things like that. Nowadays, with internet tycoons and Ivy League dropouts being all the rage, there's something of a cachet to being considered a geek. And in this study, the kids who scored high on the geek index that the researchers created, several years later, these kids went on to do better in school exams, particularly in STEM subjects, that's science, technology, engineering, and math. One of the researchers, Dr. Magdalena Janeka, said, "Our study suggests that there may be some benefits associated with having an older father. We've known for a while about the negative consequences of advanced parental age, but now we have shown that these children may also go on to have better educational and career prospects." The adverse outcomes that she hints at there for children who have older parents include autism and schizophrenia, both of which have been correlated with older parents in other studies. As for why older fathers tend to have geekier sons, there's certainly ample room for speculation. It could be as simple as older fathers having more established careers and a higher socioeconomic status, and this could mean that their sons grow up in more enriched environments with access to better education. On the other hand, there could also be something more biological at play. The researchers hypothesized that geekiness might be almost like autism light, and that there might be some overlap between the genes associated with geekiness and the genes associated with autism, says Janeka. When the child is born with only some of those genes, they may be more likely to succeed in school. However, with a higher dose of those genes and with other contributing risk factors, they may then end up with a higher predisposition for autism. This is supported by recent research showing that genes for autism are also linked with a higher IQ.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you heard it. That was all for episode number 187, the last episode of the first half of 2017. Hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, if you're looking perhaps for any of the links to the things that we've talked about here, you can find all of those online at smartdrugsmarts.com/187. By the way, thanks to those of you who have said nice things about the shiny new website that we've got. Big upgrade just got finished recently and rather pleased with things. Last week in episode number 186, I spoke about science's replication crisis with Dr. Rolf Zwan. And next week in 188, I'm going to be talking about opioid receptor gradients in the visual processing portions of the brain and why that matters. It actually matters quite a bit for one of my favorite things, curiosity. But I will say no more about that. Keep you curious for now and see you back here next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and a safe and happy 4th of July if you're in the U.S. And regardless of where you might be, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.